Hi, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here again. I came here in November for a hybrid conference, and it's nice to be here with people in the flesh again. And thank you for all the PhDs at TCLCT for for organizing this and being so nice. So, as Andrea already said, I'm a PhD candidate at University of Warwick. This title is slightly weird. I'm not good with titles, but the idea of this paper is to present a snapshot of my current PhD research, and the aim was to focus on one specific question in the interview that I had with some exophonic translators. But I am currently in the process of analyzing the responses to that question. So this is an open invitation for you to give ideas or comment on them. And actually, I will talk a little bit more also about my thesis in general. So to start with, this started because I was doing a master's back in Brazil in translation studies, and I was translating a book by Yoko Tawada, who is Japanese and writes in German. And she is very keen on the term exophony. She wrote a whole travelogue manifesto in Japanese about the term and about writing in a foreign language. And then, upon reading Chantal Wright's theories on exophonic literature and how to translate exophonic texts, I came upon this idea of exploring L2 translators, that is, translators who translate into a foreign language, into a second language. And it's something that I've done throughout my professional life and in my years as an undergrad student back in Brazil. It is something that a lot of my colleagues in translation do. They do both directions. They don't really care about directionality that much. But it is, especially in literary translation studies in the Anglophone context, it's at least in the reviewing of literature that I've done, there are implicit and explicit views against the practice. There is this L1 norm, people prefer to translate into your first language, whatever that means. And so the idea was to initially to propose the term exophonic translation to deal with these type of literary translation, because the existing terms are a bit either too wordy, or they imply that it's a second-class practice. So the idea of exophonic would bring both the theory of exophony with this practice of L2 translation. And then throughout my studies, by reading what was out there on L2 translation, which is very little, there are even fewer studies on literary L2 translation. And the ones that are there, they also focused on the text. And then with time, I started considering whether it wouldn't be more interesting to actually talk to these translators themselves rather than just, because a lot of the studies out there, they compare a source and a target text, and they decide whether the target text works because it sounds native. A lot of them end up with this conclusion, either in a positive way, yes, this type of translation is possible, or they were very negative towards the practice. So with that, I decided to go into the field of translator studies and interview exophonic translators. Just to mention quickly, L2 translation is used as a pedagogical tool, and in many contexts outside of the Anglophone world, it is also carried out daily in our professional lives. And a lot of the time, at least in my experience translating, I had the same number of modules translating into Portuguese and into English. So for us, it was never an issue. And then when I came here, suddenly it is an issue. So to start with, I released a call for translators in the mailing list of translation associations. I was focusing more on the UK and US, more so because it is a bit harder to find translators who happen to be published literary translators into English who are not in these contexts, right? Because you need the entry point, you need the networking and all that. So with help from a supervisor, from friends, I started sharing the call for translators to be interviewed, and slowly they started some dropped out, some asked to be included, and so my corpus was formed in a way. Just to briefly explain, to again what exophony is. It is simply put writing in a foreign language. And this is a quote by Wright, in which she sees exophony as a return to this neglected relationship between form and meaning. So it's not only analyzing the background of the authors, whatever, but seeing what they actually do in the text, with the text. And then I'm not going to go into detail on these quotes, but this is Tawada's view of exophony, which is a bit much more lato sensu view. So for her, writing literature is in itself already exophonic because literature is a foreign language in itself. So it's a bit more like everyone can be exophonic in her view, and she has changed her mind throughout the years. But these are the kind of the points. One is very stricto, you're writing in a foreign language, and one is more like open. A few terms that came throughout these 4 years of my PhD that I think would be interesting to mention here. Well, there's the exophone, the person who writes or speaks or steps outside their mother tongue and adopts a new language. And there's the xenophone, which is something that Ray Chow proposed, which is that person who does not want to sound like a native speaker, like opposes that idea. I do not, and this is my practice, my languaging practice. Following on Chow as well, she uses Derrida and other French-speaking scholars, a lot of post-colonial authors, to talk about language as prosthetics, as something that is added, that is outside. And similarly, we can talk about literary language and literature as a prosthetic language. So it's not natural, it's not this essentialist view of language. And then some topics that came up when analyzing the interviews I carried out are the issue of language loyalty. People are not as loyal to their languages as we think. There is this constant idea of a linguistic family romance, such as this is my mother tongue, this is my father tongue, this is my sister tongue. There's a whole family constellation to denominate those languages. And I think also to mention the term of languaging, which a lot of people know, a lot of people don't, which is simply put language as a verb and not as a noun, so the act of using language in practice, which is important when we see the interviews themselves. Some other topics that came up, gatekeeping practices. There are the strongest, in the specific questions about gatekeeping, it is the only part of my interview where all of the translators pretty much agreed, because everywhere else they were very different in like a spectrum. So all of them suffered a lot of gatekeeping towards that specific practice. Then there's also this mythical creature, the Anglo-monolingual translator/reader, who is the ideal of everything and is implied in anything, but no one really questions. What does that mean, and why are we only catering for that person, that ideal person? And then also the ideas of lingualism, which is language with a capital L, like all the separate languages that we see as entities and monoliths, and not as more fluid, diverse realities and practices. So the interviews, as I said, that's where I dived into translator studies a bit more. That's when I found out the whole area of translator studies quite late in my PhD. I adopted a phenomenographic approach. I didn't know that was what it was called. I created the questions, and then after looking through the questions and applying for ethics approval, I realized that there's a name for what I was doing, which is when you want to see, you don't want a specific answer, you don't want a yes or no answer, you don't want a right or wrong answer, you want the subjects, the way they conceptualize the phenomena around them. And also, it's important to mention that the researcher is included in that approach. It is, in a sense, what I'm doing is auto-theory, because I'm not lying, I do like to translate into English, and people tell me I can't. So this is basically one of the biggest motivations of doing this. So obviously, me as an interviewer, I relate to my interviewees, and so our conversation, this is important for the approach that I'm taking. And then I just made a joke about the title of the conference and who's afraid of exophonic translators. Well, there's a lot of people who are, even though they don't know it yet. So this is a bit too much, but this is just, if anyone's curious, this is the whole of the questions. and they're split in themes. So the first is approaches to languages, which is very broad and general, and and yeah, was the trickiest part, because in transcribing all these interviews, people go on all sorts of tangents. They don't have a specific. Not that I was asking for a specific answer, but at one point you just get a bit frustrated, just like get to the point. And this first part was very much, people just talking about anything relating to language. So that's why it was so hard to find these patterns that I'm going to talk about. Then the specific questions about directionality, which I thought would be the most interesting, would yield the most interesting answers, but they are to this point, they are not the most interesting that I've analyzed so far. Then market and gatekeeping, that's the one that, as I said, those are the ones that, in general, the interviewees agreed on more strongly. Then there's two questions about creative writing, fluency, and translation, which were also slightly problematic, because then there's also, I use the term fluency, and some people understand that as being proficiency. Some people went really literary and started talking about flows and floods and all of that. And some people were very specific. Oh yeah, I'm proficient. I got a C1 in the charter or whatever. So this was what I analyzed and presented in November here. And then in the end, it was just like out of pure curiosity. I wanted to know how trained these translators were, and if they had translation training at the university level, if they, like me, had both directions in their training. And then lastly, are you a member of a professional association? I just wanted to know how they are related to their community of translators, and how they relate to translators who are not necessarily doing the same thing they are doing. So just to mention, I'm going to focus on that underlined question, which is, how would you describe your relationship to the languages you can speak, /write/translate? It's a bit clunky, and you can see from the question, it's my fault how much they talked about different things, because it's very broad, But in the word relationship, I wanted to see if they were going to use these linguistic family romance terms, this is related to the first question, in which I asked them if they have what they consider to be a mother tongue, a first language, but I add other terms so that they can also criticize the terms that I used in the question itself. So the trends that I got here are basically the answers to this question and to the first question, because they are very much connected. And some of the interviewees actually answered this question in the other question. So it's a bit confusing, but I'll explain. So there was a strong political trend in all of the answers. I just took these two quotes as examples. Again, I'm not going to read it. There's a long quote. But for example, translator number 1 is a Korean translator, and talks about the political power that speaking English confers to anyone in Korea. That it is a huge intellectual commodity to be able to speak it, and that him being having grown up in many different places, had this commodity to use in his life, in his professional life in Korea. And then he mentioned this weird political connotation, and then he mentioned again that the Korean is the vassal state of America, and he mentions that throughout the interview. So at least for translator number 1, it's very clear that this is there's not any language, it's English specifically. But I just wanted to just use parts of their response just to as an example. But a lot of the translators, almost all of them, had here or there, either in the answer to this question or further on in the interview, mentioned some kind of political struggle there, or the dynamics that are involved. Then the family or the tree analogy, as I mentioned before. So, for example, translator number 3 says that that Portuguese feels like a close friend, like a childhood friend, or like a relative. But then translator number 3 says that it's not an unambiguous relationship, same as with a sibling. Then translator number 9 said that it doesn't know if they necessarily feel more connected to the languages that their parents speak. Interesting enough, translator number 9 is from Singapore. Their father Tamil, and their mother is Malay speaking, and the language of the household is English, but the language, their mother tongue in Singapore is Chinese, because their mom is ethnic Chinese. So it's a whole thing. He doesn't speak any of the languages of his parents, he speaks English. So that's why for this person it wasn't really important. He doesn't feel more connected to the languages. And then translator number 14 said that it is like different members of a family or as different limbs in the body. And then, interestingly enough, they mentioned that they are an illegitimate child because they said that English is a mother tongue for them. But then they said, oh, I can't really say that because I'm not really related by blood to English or something like that. And then they said, oh, I really like the family metaphor. And then right afterwards, translator number 14 says, I don't think we should shoehorn a reality like language into metaphors of this sort. So they also contradict themselves throughout the interview, so they're not really sure of these things. This is just, I don't have much time, and I realize, just to show that this relationship can be contentious, traumatic. Your relationship to your mother tongue can, be tied to traumatic and to abuse, and so I had some of that in the answers as well. And then some people finding refuge in another language. There is the strong undercurrent of alienation and distance, feeling alienated, feeling distance from your first language due to many reasons. It can be preferring to work in a different language just because this is new, this is not what I had. What I had is something that I'm bored of already, or that don't have the same relation to. Some people say that they have multiple personalities related to the language. In each language they have one. One thing that showed up quite a lot was the idea of ownership or mastery of language. Oh, these are my languages. I know them, I control them, I master them. I worked really hard, as translator number 7 said. I've worked really hard to be good at them. So why can't I speak all of them and write in all of them? So a lot of the translators mentioned the idea of a love they have for the languages. That's why a love for literature in a certain language, a love for a certain language, or falling in love with someone from that language. So that was a strong undercurrent in the responses. The translator number 12 said, "Yeah, it makes me feel things," which was a lot of the answers were a lot around that. Like, just don't know how to explain it. I just love it. It's a language of love for me. So some tentative conclusions and trends that I could find in interviews in general, not only in this question, was that gatekeeping seems to be more influential than I thought it was, than directionality itself. I thought directionality would come up more and would be more of an issue for the translators, but gatekeeping seemed to be more of a trend. For most of these non-Anglo monolingual translators, the question of language loyalty or a hierarchy of language does not really fit monolingual expectations, and then directionality does not seem to be much of an issue. So for them, they don't have a first and second language, so the direction or whether you should translate into L1 doesn't really make sense for these people. So directionality also seems to be more influenced by preferences in genre, by experience, and for demand rather than language loyalty or this hierarchy. And then just these ideas of language as prosthetics, language drag, and languaging seem to be more important to define these translators than these lingualist definitions of trying to understand if they are an L2, an L3, an LX translator. Then these are my references, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lúcia. There's certainly lots of food for thought in there. Do we have any questions?
Okay, thank you for your great presentation. I just would like to clarify, because you used the term gatekeeping, but I wasn't really sure what it meant in this context. It just wasn't clear to me. Could you just explain?
So it is a bit confusing, but what we understood it as, it was, for example, someone, especially the native speaker, gatekeeping, saying that you cannot enter this realm, or like there's a call for translators, and then they say, only native speakers, please. So they are controlling who gets in and who gets out. So in a way, in a very simple way, that's what we mean by gatekeeping is through institutions that put these rules in place. It's through translation scholars who put these in encyclopedia and training, say like you should do this, you should do that, and then also in practice, a lot of times these translators come against editors or proofreaders who go and say, well, use their authority as a native speaker to say you are not, and sometimes without even reading the text. That happens quite a lot. So that's what gatekeeping is in this situation.
So I think in one of your conclusions it said gatekeeping was a more influential factor than the language combination,
Yeah.
the directionality. So you mean the desire to kind of overcome that this gatekeeping, or
that the translators themselves didn't have necessarily a preference or the problem with the work they actually ended up doing, the amount of work they did in each direction, was more due to these external gatekeepers than to their own preference or difficulties translating into L1, L2. That's what I meant. I don't know if that makes sense.
no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just was wondering, it's very interesting, thank you. I just was wondering if there's a distinction at all, or maybe it's just, maybe they're more or less interchangeable, but is there a difference between exophonic writers, translators, and translingual? I presume this, you've come across
Well,
this.
yes, I do.
Yeah. Is
Well,
there a
I was
choice
thinking
of-
about that again because another conference in November, there was someone presenting on translingual translation and translingual authors. There isn't like a strict, no one came and said, oh, this is exophony, it's very different from translingualism. But I think of translingualism, and I remember translanguaging, which came up with this specific context of Welsh translingual translanguaging practices in the classroom, where a teacher would speak in English and the children would respond in Welsh, and then in literature there are examples of, but it is quite tricky. I just didn't want to necessarily talk about it. I had a better answer for this. Let me think. Well, I think about translanguaging as it reminds me of this specific context, which is why I'm not really thinking of that. And but I think a lot of exophonic authors could be called translingual as well. I don't think there's a strict difference. I just like exophonic because of the idea of outside and phone and because Tawada used it and it's more used in the German-speaking tradition before Tawada even. It hasn't really traveled outside of that. So there's translingual, which is I think in some cases they can be both. They can be the same thing.
Because I think there's a definite distinction between translingualism and translanguaging. Those
Yeah,
are separate
yeah.
things, but translingualism seems to be similar to what you're
It
talking
is,
about.
it
But I wonder if there's a distinction to be made, and if that distinction is an important one. I mean, I personally find translingualism a little fuzzy sometimes, and I don't know if what you're talking about is actually more specific than that. So yeah,
I just think that translingualism could be also if you're a bilingual, a multilingual subject, like if you had in a household who spoke more than 2 languages or that, and then you write sometimes, there are authors who then write in these 2, 3, 4 languages that they have growing up, whereas exophonic is specifically a language that it is clearly a foreign language for you. So that's, I think, the division. I think it's more clear for me in that way that, there's no question that you didn't grow up with that language. I think of, in my case, for example, I grew up with German and Portuguese. So if I were to write German / like a literary text that was translingual in that way, that incorporated German, Portuguese, and Guarani, which is another language that I have from growing up, then that would be a translingual text that really spoke to my experience, my multilingual experience. And then choosing to write in English was a conscious choice that I made. It was a bit more like external to me, I think. That would be, no one has differentiated between them. I'm trying now, but yeah.
Thanks.
I could, yes. No, I was found this really interesting, working myself as a translator, and not entirely sure which direction to pick, as it were, so I found that really interesting. I was just curious, when you put out your call in an email to the mailing lists, and you phrased it as whether they've had work that could count as L2 translation, I imagine there's a certain amount of kind of self-selection going on in terms of which translators would look at that and think, well, that applies to me. And so what I'm a little bit curious about is, did you see any tendencies for the people who responded to be translators who had grown up with multiple languages or who had acquired the multiple languages later on? Did you see any tendency in that direction?
There was a mix. So basically we sent out a call, and the whole process took years and years and years, because then the pandemic happened and everything changed. But we initially sent out a call, then we had around 20 respondents that were from mixed backgrounds. Some of them had grown up in different countries and were, or had a more multilingual background in their family. And like about half of them were just, all of their basic schooling was in their mother tongue, first language. That wasn't much of an issue there. They had a very clear L1. And then in their adult, they went to university or for a postgraduate course in this other country and then stayed. What I saw is that a lot of the ones, the second type of translator, are also much older and have been in the country, English-speaking country in that case, for like decades. Whereas some of the more, it is quite tricky to find these trends, but basically I found that a lot of the more literary types, a bit younger, and then these were also people who grew up in different countries and also had specific accesses to some of the networking that goes on and had people they knew in publishing, so they ended up entering that way. And some others, after years and years and years of work and having been consecrated, then they were able to enter in and do that specifically in literary translation, but they had already like decades of work behind them. So these are the two people mostly that make up the group. What happens is that a lot of people dropped out because of the pandemic. Just people, I feel that you might disagree with me, but a lot of translators are not really keen to talk about, and especially again a Skype interview. Some were very keen. They talked for 2.5 hours, and some were very to the point. But a lot of them just dropped out because they had too much on their plates with the pandemic, and they were already doing everything through screens. They didn't want to do an interview through a screen again. Then out of these initial respondents, a lot dropped out, and then the ones that actually were interviewed started to suggest other people and tell their friends and tell people they knew. So that's how it ended up getting to the group. But it's a small group. It's not. I don't think it's not statistically. I mean, I cannot. These conclusions are I'm very cautious about them because it's 14 people. But it is hard to find them to start with. So to find 14 who are eager to talk is already, I find, is big work. So yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, it does, yes. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. I have two observations. So the first one was as regards like translingualism and exophony. Might it be the case that translingualism likes to be a bit more fluid than exophony? Because Kemmer likes to come up with these kind of distinctions as in, this is ambilingual and this is something else, where exophony is just, okay, you all speak this language is the first language, and then language X is your other language, and you translate into that. Might it be the case?
That's what I ended up concluding, actually, in answering the question. But you see from what Tawada says sometimes, it's like, oh, not everyone who writes in a foreign language has these immigration backgrounds, or sometimes you just literally obviously there's always forces that make you choose a specific language, but it was more of a conscious, as Tawada herself was in her 20s, decided to go to Germany. and started learning German and started writing in German, there was not, there were other languages that maybe if she did translingualism would be in the forefront than German. I don't know. It's just, maybe we should come up with a differentiation, but that's the attempt at one.
And the other thing that struck me was the idea of language as prosthetics. And so language is something which is not inherently human, but something other. Then it might be the case that everybody is an exophonic speaker. Can you please elaborate a bit on,
well, as a Portuguese speaker, I find it really complicated, and I think anyone who knows Saussure knows a little bit the whole idea between, in Portuguese you have linguagem and língua. So língua is the language with a capital L, is Portuguese, is French, is whatever, and linguagem is the kind of inner ability that all of us have as humans, that kind of thing. So for me, it's if you speak a language that differentiates between these two, it's much clearer that yes, language is natural, is inherent in us. We have a natural. If you follow Chomsky, you have a natural grammar, like an inner grammar and all that. But language with a capital L, and language in the way that we see it, like especially in literary language and written language, it is not artificial, but it is outside. It's not natural. Writing literature is not making art itself. It's a mixture of inspiration or whatever you want to call it, and it's also craft that you sit down and you practice and you do it. Literature is also that. So it's an external language. So that's what Tawada thinks, that anyone who writes literature is an exophonic writer, because literature is a foreign language to all of us. You have to learn it, and it's outside of the person. So yeah, to that.
Thank you very much. Anybody else from the audience? Okay, well, we left everybody speechless. Thank you very much.